I've been making art about the relationship between nature and development here in South Korea, specifically in Seoul, for a few years now. And I suppose you could term what I'm doing Anthropocene art, although I do understand why some people feel rather uncomfortable with that term. It has sort of a plummy kind of bourgeois quality to it, and it can be adapted in a very hypocritical way. A point that I'll return to in a moment. But for the most part, I think it's a valid, necessary term. I first came across it in conversations with Yves Millet, who I made my first feature-length movie with, and he's a French scholar. He's a rather humble sort, and when I first described him as a scholar of the Anthropocene, he said, "No, no, 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 ce n'est pas vrai." But he has thought a great deal about this topic and written on it and thought about it. He was my introduction, and I do think it's a valid area of study. I do think that the Anthropocene is real. This summer has been an alarming one in terms of heat waves, especially in northern India and parts of the Middle East, changed climate sort of timing here in South Korea, and very disturbing degrees of melt and warming in the Arctic and Antarctic. Will the situation stabilize? Who knows? But we have to assume the worst and start preparing as a society for some big changes, some big effective changes, not just cosmetic ones. Now, one reason, as I just said, I feel a little bit uncomfortable with the term Anthropocene, and one reason is because of a documentary called The Anthropocene, The Human Era, which I think was well-intentioned but rather flawed. And one specific point that I'd make about it is that it does not mention air travel at all. Now, that particular film crew did have to travel internationally to several places, and surely they were aware of air travel as a contributing factor. Military systems and civilian aviation constitute around a 50-50 split in terms of pollution caused by airplanes. Both of them could do with a reduction. The trend right now these days is for people to sometimes say, "I don't fly anymore, I'm giving it up." Well, it's not that simple. People, one thing that we have to remember about civilian aviation, as it is for regular, average people like us, is it's a form of mass transit, and if you're not in that seat, somebody else will be. It's the planes themselves, the number of planes in the sky, that need to be reduced, not the number of passengers per plane. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is artists who travel a lot have got to start dealing with this and start thinking about their own behavior. I know some gifted artists who nevertheless seem to have almost an addiction to going to conferences, to going to events and so forth. And at a certain point, there does need to be a little bit of reduction, a little bit of self-control, a little bit of placing the needs of the community ahead of one's own career. That's another point that I'd like to make. And finally, to return to the movie, The Anthropocene, in one section of the movie, as I said, it doesn't mention air travel at all, which is a very serious admission. But in another section of the movie, it's quite critical of a big church in Africa. I think it's in Lagos, which is built of wood. Well, it has to be built of something. And the movie focuses on this congregation dancing. It's a revivalist church. And it's fascinating footage, but the way it's framed within the documentary is somewhat disturbing the more you think about it. It does almost have a racist kind of tinge to it, as if the problem is all these people, the church can fit 1 million adherents in a million people. That is not really the problem. The problem isn't the big church. The problem isn't that it's made of wood. The problem is city design, and that's something that we have to think about with all the major cities of the world. How do they balance development and the protection of nature?